The empty table. Natalie rose, shifted uneasily in her chair, the white linen beneath her hands smooth but strangely cold, as though even the fabric knew she was out of place in this elegant restaurant. She had never been someone who sought out luxury. A small cafe with mismatched chairs and a quiet corner to read her favorite novel would have been enough. But tonight she had let her friends convince her to take a chance, to step into a place where the walls gleamed with golden light, and every table seemed occupied by a couple lost in their own world. The soft melody of a jazz trio floated through the air, blending with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from tables nearby. Each sound seemed to remind her that she was sitting alone, staring at the flickering candle between polished silver cutlery, waiting for someone who had not bothered to show up. Her phone sat on the table like a judge, glowing with the minutes she had been waiting, each number that rolled forward another reminder of her foolish hope. 5 minutes had stretched to 10, then 30, and now nearly 40 had passed. She checked again, though she already knew there would be no new message, no explanation that could take away the sting of being forgotten. The waiter, kind though he was, had begun to glance at her with the sort of polite pity that made her cheeks burn. She could almost hear what he must be thinking, that she had been stood up, that this was just another young woman trying her luck at modern dating, only to discover how cruelly disappointing it could be. At 26, Natalie was used to disappointment in small doses. Life in a corporate office rarely allowed dreams to bloom. She worked long hours at Crosstech Industries, where deadlines consumed her evenings and weekends blurred into PowerPoint slides and marketing campaigns. Her small studio apartment in downtown Seattle often felt like little more than a place to sleep between projects. Her friends had grown tired of her excuses, of hearing that she was too busy or too tired, and had pushed her toward trying online dating. "What's the worst that could happen?" one of them had said with a grin, not realizing how heavy that question might feel now as Natalie traced her finger absently along the rim of her water glass. She thought of the man she was supposed to meet, someone who had called himself David. His messages had been kind, thoughtful even, filled with light-hearted jokes and genuine questions about her interests. He had claimed to work in finance, had mentioned his love for hiking in the Cascades, and had spoken warmly about old movies, the kind Natalie loved to watch on rainy weekends curled up in her blanket with a cup of tea. He had seemed different from others she had spoken to, less rehearsed, more genuine. But now, as the minutes ticked by without his arrival, she realized that perhaps she had been nothing more than entertainment for a stranger who had grown bored before they even met. Her phone buzzed at last, but the message it delivered was brief and final. "Sorry, something came up. Can't make it tonight." The words cut deeper than she expected. She could almost laugh at how simple they were, how easily they dismissed her. Gathering her purse, she signaled for the check, fighting the urge to cry at her own table. It wasn't heartbreak that weighed on her chest, but humiliation. The sense that she had opened herself up only to be made into a fool. Her friends would ask about the date tomorrow, eager for details, and she would have to smile and say it hadn't worked out. They wouldn't see the way her heart clenched in this moment. How small and invisible she felt in a world where everyone else seemed to belong. The city lights shimmered outside the window as she waited for the waiter. Cars passed along the harbor road, their headlights painting shifting patterns across the water. She tried to lose herself in the view, to remind herself that the world was still wide and full of possibility. Even if tonight had left her feeling diminished, she could go home, curl up with a novel, maybe order takeout from the little Thai place she liked. Life would go on. That was the simple truth she told herself, though it did little to soothe the ache in her chest. Then the restaurant door chimed, and everything shifted. A cool October breeze swept into the room as the door opened, carrying with it a presence that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere. Natalie looked up without thinking, her gaze drawn by instinct, and froze. Walking through the entrance was Julian Cross. Even from across the room there was no mistaking him. His tall frame carried itself with effortless command, his dark hair immaculately styled, his tailored coat cut to perfection. He had the kind of presence that silenced a room without effort, the sort of charisma that made people look twice whether they wanted to or not. At 34, Julian Cross had become a legend not only in Seattle but across the entire business world. He was the founder and CEO of Crosstech, the company where Natalie herself worked. Though her role as a marketing assistant placed her many rungs down the ladder, almost in a different universe. She had seen him before at company-wide meetings and annual award ceremonies, always from a distance, always surrounded by executives and board members who seemed to orbit him like satellites around a star. Never had she imagined that she would see him here, in the same restaurant, his eyes scanning the dining room with an expression she could not quite read. For a wild moment she prayed he wouldn't notice her. The last thing she needed tonight was for her powerful, untouchable boss to see her sitting alone, abandoned at a table for two. But then his gaze landed on her. Her breath caught, and her fingers tightened around her purse strap as if bracing against impact. He was looking directly at her, his gray eyes sharp yet strangely intent. And then, impossibly, he began walking toward her. Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs as 1,000 fears ran through her mind. Had she done something wrong at work? Was he here to fire her? Had she left confidential files out or missed a critical deadline? Each step he took seemed to magnify the pounding in her chest until she thought she might faint from sheer anticipation. When he reached her table, he stopped and studied her face with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and inexplicably seen. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice smooth and warm, deeper than she remembered from the company's video conferences. "May I sit down?" Too stunned to speak, Natalie could only nod. He slid into the chair across from her with the grace of someone used to being in control, folding his hands lightly on the table as though this were the most natural thing in the world. For several seconds, silence stretched between them, filled only by the music and the clink of glasses around the room. Natalie tried to process what was happening, but her mind struggled to catch up. "You look surprised," Julian said finally, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's an understatement," she managed, her voice small, uncertain. "Mr. Cross, I don't understand. Are you meeting someone here?" His smile widened, softening his normally serious features. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "I am. You." The word struck her like a physical blow, leaving her dizzy with disbelief. "I'm sorry, what?" "The man you were supposed to meet tonight," Julian said, his tone calm but his eyes searching hers. "That was me." Natalie stared at him, the room spinning in her peripheral vision. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. "That's impossible. I was meeting someone from a dating app. His name was David Mitchell. He said he worked in finance." Julian's expression turned more serious, the humor fading. "David Mitchell," he confirmed quietly. "That's the name I used." Her heart lurched. You're telling me all those messages, all those conversations, they were with you?" "Yes," he said simply, without flinching. "I wanted to meet someone who saw me as a man, not as a CEO. Someone who didn't care about headlines or board meetings. I apologize for the deception, but I couldn't think of another way to find that." Natalie felt the world tilt beneath her. Everything about the past few weeks, the jokes, the shared stories about books, the talk of travel and rainy Sunday mornings, suddenly carried new weight. She had thought she was speaking with a stranger who might become a friend, maybe even more. Instead, she had been opening her heart to Julian Cross, the billionaire who signed her paychecks and stood on stages commanding the attention of thousands. "This is insane," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're my boss. You're Julian Cross. You don't date employees through apps." "You're right," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with something that sounded like vulnerability. "It's complicated. It's inadvisable. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the first time we spoke. You told me about your dream of opening a bookstore, about the lavender fields you want to visit someday. You laughed at my terrible jokes. Do you know how rare that is?" Natalie wanted to protest, to say this was impossible, reckless even. But when she met his gaze, she saw something unexpected. Loneliness, a deep and aching kind that mirrored her own. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire in glossy magazines, but the man behind him. And against all reason, her heart stirred with the dangerous thought that perhaps this night was only just beginning. The hidden connection. Monday morning arrived with the cruel indifference of reality, shoving aside the magic of Saturday night as though it had never existed. Natalie Rose sat at her desk on the 15th floor of Crosstech Industries, staring blankly at her computer screen, while the office buzzed around her with its usual rhythm of clicking keyboards, ringing phones, and hushed conversations about project deadlines. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, and the burnt smell of stale coffee from the break room curled into her senses, grounding her in a world that suddenly felt foreign. Her body was present in her cubicle, but her mind refused to stop replaying every moment of that unexpected evening. The candlelit table, the soft way he had said her name, the revelation that David had been Julian Cross all along, and most of all the kiss they had shared under the streetlight. Gentle, questioning, full of promise, these memories had refused to leave her alone, and yet, surrounded by the gray partitions of corporate life, it all felt like a dream now. The Julian who sat across from her on Saturday, vulnerable and human, was not the Julian who commanded an empire from the top floor of this skyscraper. Here he was again, the untouchable CEO, whose signature decisions shaped entire industries, not the man who made terrible puns and admitted to feeling lonely. Natalie tried to bury herself in her tasks, drafting a marketing brief, rechecking data on last quarter's ad campaign, but the words blurred on the screen as her mind spun. How was she supposed to act if she saw him here? Would he acknowledge her? Would he ignore her? Would he regret everything and decide it had been a mistake? Her cubicle neighbor Jessica leaned over the partition with her usual burst of energy, snapping Natalie out of her daze. "You look different," Jessica said, squinting at her curiously. "Like you had an exciting weekend. Did you finally go on that blind date you were nervous about?" Natalie felt heat rise in her cheeks and forced a casual smile. "It was fine," she said quickly, her voice steadier than she felt. She could hardly tell Jessica or anyone that her boring date had transformed into dinner with their CEO. That was madness. A secret too fragile to share. Jessica raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but before she could pry further, a hush fell across the office floor. Conversations stilled, fingers paused on keyboards, and all eyes seemed to lift as the man himself entered. Julian Cross walked through the open workspace, every stride purposeful, every detail immaculate. His charcoal gray suit fit like it had been tailored by angels, his polished shoes silent on the carpet, his presence commanding the kind of attention that no announcement could ever achieve. Natalie's pulse quickened as he drew closer. She ducked her head, pretending to study the marketing report in front of her, though her eyes could not help flickering upward as he passed. For the briefest moment, she caught a subtle trace of his cologne, the same clean, warm scent she had noticed when he walked her home. Her breath hitched, and she thought she saw his stride falter just slightly, as if he were tempted to acknowledge her. But he kept moving, heading toward the elevators without so much as a glance in her direction. Around her, co-workers whispered, admiring his sharpness, speculating about which department he would scrutinize this week. Jessica whistled under her breath. "He's looking particularly intense today. I heard he's personally reviewing all the quarterly reports. Thank God I'm not in charge of anything important." Natalie managed a tight nod, her mind spinning. Had Saturday meant anything to him? Or was he already compartmentalizing, slipping back into the role of CEO as though nothing had happened? She wanted to believe the connection had been real, but doubt gnawed at her resolve. The lines between personal and professional blurred so dangerously that she could hardly breathe. The day dragged on in slow motion. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt with hope, only to crash when it was just an email reminder or a team chat notification. She forced herself to complete a presentation for an upcoming campaign, though she had to redo it twice after catching glaring mistakes she never would have made under normal circumstances. Her concentration had vanished, stolen by the weight of uncertainty. Then, late in the afternoon, her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat before opening it. "I can't stop thinking about Saturday night. Can we talk?" Her pulse quickened as though a current had surged through her veins. She glanced around the office, making sure no one was watching before quickly typing back. "This is dangerous. What if someone sees?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me in conference room C at 5:15. I'll make sure it's empty." Natalie stared at the message, her stomach knotting with a mixture of excitement and dread. The clock seemed to mock her as the minutes crept forward. She tried to focus on finishing her report, but her eyes kept darting back to the time on her screen. When the hands finally reached 5:10, she saved her work, gathered her things with trembling hands, and slipped toward the elevators while most of her colleagues were preparing to leave. Conference room C was tucked away on the 20th floor, a small space usually reserved for video calls with clients in other time zones. Its glass walls overlooked the glittering city, offering a breathtaking view of Seattle at dusk. When she arrived, her palms sweaty and her heart racing, she found Julian already there, standing by the window with his jacket off, his tie loosened, and his sleeves rolled up. He looked more human like this, less like the untouchable CEO, and more like the man who had once signed his messages with bad jokes and little anecdotes about favorite films. When he turned to face her, his expression softened with relief. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same warmth that had disarmed her 2 nights ago. "I wasn't sure you would." Natalie stayed near the door, hyper-aware that anyone walking by could see them through the glass. "Julian, this is insane. We can't meet like this at work." "I know," he admitted, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "It's complicated, it's risky. But I couldn't go through the entire day pretending Saturday night didn't happen. Not after what I felt." His gray eyes held hers with a sincerity that made her chest tighten. Her resolve wavered. "What do you want from me? What do you expect this to be?" For the first time, Julian seemed uncertain. He ran a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristically vulnerable gesture for someone who so rarely appeared shaken. "I don't know," he confessed. "I've never been in this position before. But I know I want to see you again. Away from this building, away from all the expectations and the eyes that follow me everywhere. I want us." Natalie's thoughts raced. The weight of the risks pressed on her from every side. Rumors among colleagues, accusations of favoritism. The possible wrath of the board if they discovered their CEO was entangled with a marketing assistant. Yet beneath all that, beneath the fear and the logic, her heart remembered the loneliness in his voice when he had asked, when was the last time someone had laughed at his jokes for real? She had seen something in him that few others had, and it called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Her silence stretched too long, and Julian stepped back slightly, as though preparing himself for rejection. "If you tell me no, I'll respect that," he said firmly. "I'll never use my position to pressure you, but I had to be honest about what I feel." Natalie's throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how we could make this work." His lips curved in a faint, almost hopeful smile. "Then let's not worry about the how just yet. Let's just see where this takes us." Something in his certainty steadied her, a small flame against the storm of doubt. She nodded, almost against her own better judgment. "Okay, we'll see." The relief that washed over his face made her chest ache. In that moment, she realized that beneath his armor of power and success, Julian Cross was simply a man who longed for connection, for someone to see him as more than the sum of his achievements. And against all reason, she was willing to take a step into the unknown with him. The weeks that followed became a delicate dance of secrecy and discovery. They developed their own hidden language. Emails about project updates that disguised dinner invitations, text messages sent in code so they could communicate without arousing suspicion. They met in small cafes far from the corporate district, places where no one would recognize them, where they could laugh freely and talk about books, movies, and childhood memories without the weight of titles and hierarchies pressing down on them. Julian revealed parts of himself that never appeared in magazine interviews. He spoke of a childhood that looked privileged from the outside but was hollow on the inside. Parents who cared more about appearances than affection. Dinners eaten at long tables where silence was more common than conversation. He told her about raising his younger sister after their parents died suddenly. About the crushing responsibility of building a company while being barely more than a boy himself. His wealth had insulated him from hunger, but not from loneliness. His success had surrounded him with admirers but stripped him of trust. In turn, Natalie shared her own struggles. Her family's financial difficulties that had forced her to work long hours while juggling student loans. Her abandoned dream of writing a novel that still sat in a drawer, half-finished and collecting dust. Her fear that she was invisible in a world that rewarded confidence and ambition above quiet diligence. "You're not invisible," Julian said one evening, as they walked along the waterfront, the city lights reflecting off the water. His voice was steady, certain. "Not to me." The words struck her deeper than she expected, igniting something inside her that she had almost forgotten, a belief that perhaps she was worth being seen, worth being chosen. At work, they remained careful, professional, never allowing a glance or gesture to betray them. But Natalie found herself looking forward to his messages, to the evenings they carved out of their demanding lives, to the feeling of being with someone who understood the loneliness she had carried for so long. Yet beneath the growing intimacy, a quiet fear remained, whispering of consequences they could not ignore. And when a new figure arrived at Crosstech, Rebecca Stone, the striking and ambitious new vice president of strategic development, Natalie felt the first tremor of the storm that threatened to unravel everything. Stolen moments. The winter days crept in slowly, casting Seattle beneath a constant drizzle that turned the city lights into shimmering reflections on the streets. For most employees at Crosstech, the gray skies blended into the grind of deadlines and endless meetings. But for Natalie Rose, every day carried a secret pulse beneath its surface. Behind her careful professionalism lay a hidden world, one built of cryptic messages, stolen hours in quiet cafes, and long conversations that stretched into the night with the man who, to everyone else, was an untouchable figure towering above the company. For her, Julian Cross was not only the CEO, not only the legend whose name filled headlines, but also the man who teased her with terrible puns, who remembered the details of her family, and who confessed fears he had never allowed another soul to hear. The secrecy was both exhilarating and exhausting. At work, Natalie perfected the art of indifference. She kept her eyes fixed on her reports when Julian passed by, never lingering, never allowing her gaze to betray the truth burning beneath the surface. She responded to his coded emails as though they were nothing more than professional exchanges, her heart thundering while her colleagues read them as routine. When coworkers gossiped about his decisions or speculated about his personal life, she forced herself to remain silent, to blend in, to laugh at the appropriate moments. Yet inside she carried the weight of knowing him in ways they could not imagine. It was in the stolen moments far from the corporate tower that their bond grew real. They discovered hidden cafes tucked into side streets, their booths dimly lit and private enough to hold their laughter. Sometimes they would walk along the waterfront, their conversations weaving through books, family, childhood memories, and the quiet ache of responsibilities. Julian listened in a way few people ever had. He asked questions not to impress her but to understand her, to draw out the dreams she had buried beneath years of practicality. She spoke of her unfinished novel, of the lavender fields in France she longed to see, of the bookstore she once imagined opening but had abandoned as impractical. His eyes would light up at these confessions as though he saw not just the woman she was but the one she might become, if only she believed in her own worth. And Julian revealed more of himself as well. He spoke of the hollow grandeur of growing up in a family more concerned with appearances than love, of parents who measured affection in social gatherings rather than quiet moments of tenderness. He told her of raising his younger sister after their parents' sudden deaths, of the nights when he juggled building a company while comforting a child who had lost everything. He admitted that the empire he built sometimes felt like a prison, each decision heavy with the lives it affected, each success shadowed by loneliness. To the world he was invincible. To her he allowed himself to be vulnerable, human. But shadows began to gather at the edges of their fragile happiness. It began with whispers, little murmurs in the office about how often Julian seemed to appear near the marketing floor, about how his emails sometimes included unusually detailed questions for projects far below his usual focus. Natalie brushed them off as paranoia, but the whispers grew. She noticed curious glances from colleagues when her phone buzzed, saw knowing smirks when she left for lunch alone, and felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on her. The thrill of secrecy slowly began to shift into the tension of being hunted by invisible eyes. The tension reached its first true test with the arrival of Rebecca Stone. She entered Crosstech like a storm wrapped in silk and steel. Tall, striking, with fiery red hair and a wardrobe that spoke of power and ambition, Rebecca was everything Natalie was not. She commanded immediate attention the moment she walked into a room, her voice clear, her confidence unshakable. As the new vice president of strategic development, she was granted an office on the executive floor, a perch from which she quickly extended her influence. Rumors swirled that she had been recruited from a rival company with promises of rapid advancement, that she was close with several board members, that she had been brought in not only to lead but to challenge, perhaps even to replace those who grew too comfortable at the top. From the first moment Natalie saw her sweeping through the lobby with her entourage of assistants, she felt an instinctive shiver of unease. This was not a woman who left things unnoticed. Rebecca wasted no time asserting herself. Within days she had reorganized entire departments, questioned long-standing protocols, and inserted herself into meetings that once belonged solely to Julian. Employees admired her boldness even as they feared her scrutiny. To Natalie, she represented a threat not only to the delicate balance of the company, but to the secret she carried within her chest. Rebecca's sharp eyes seemed to notice everything, and Natalie could not shake the feeling that she was already under silent evaluation. The first true collision came during a strategy meeting. Natalie sat quietly at the far end of the long table, flipping through notes on a campaign proposal. Julian, seated at the head, was his usual composed self. But when his gaze flickered toward her for the briefest second, Natalie felt her stomach tighten. It was only a glance, one so subtle that no one else might have noticed, except Rebecca. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, Rebecca approached Natalie with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're Natalie Rose, aren't you? Marketing assistant." Her voice was smooth, polished, each word measured. "Yes," Natalie replied, forcing her tone into polite neutrality. Rebecca's gaze lingered just a little too long. "I'll be keeping an eye on your department. I hear your CEO has taken quite an interest in your projects." The words were innocuous on the surface, but the sharpness beneath them cut deep. Natalie managed a small smile, murmured something about appreciating the support, and hurried back to her desk, but the unease stayed with her, burrowing into her thoughts long after the day ended. For the first time, she realized that their secret was no longer safe within the shadows. Someone was watching, and that someone had the power to unravel everything. That night, when she met Julian at a quiet restaurant on the edge of the city, she told him about the exchange. He listened, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching briefly into a fist before relaxing. "Rebecca is ambitious," he admitted, "and she's dangerous. But don't let her intimidate you. What we have is ours, and no one can take that away." Natalie wanted to believe him, but she couldn't ignore the fear twisting in her chest. The stakes were rising. She wasn't just risking gossip among co-workers anymore. She was risking exposure at the highest levels of the company. Yet in the quiet that followed, as Julian reached across the table and took her hand in his, she felt the same warmth that had first drawn her to him. His certainty steadied her, even as the storm gathered beyond the walls of their fragile sanctuary. The weeks that followed became a test of endurance. Their stolen moments grew even more precious, each one carrying the weight of knowing it could be their last. They walked more carefully, chose their meeting places with more caution, avoided messages that might be traced, but the connection between them only deepened. Every risk seemed to weave their bond tighter, every challenge a reminder of how much they were willing to fight for. And yet Rebecca Stone was not the type to miss patterns. Natalie could feel the net drawing tighter, each day a reminder that secrecy had an expiration date. The night she received an anonymous envelope slid beneath her apartment door, a single photograph of her leaving a cafe with Julian, his hand resting on her back. Natalie realized the storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The breaking point. The photograph lay on Natalie's kitchen table like a living thing, its edges curled slightly from the damp night air that had clung to it when she first picked it up from the floor inside her apartment. She had stared at it for what felt like hours, though in reality it had only been minutes, her breath shallow, her pulse racing with a cold dread that coiled itself around her heart. The image was unmistakable. She and Julian leaving a cafe on the waterfront, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. Her face tilted upward, caught mid-smile, her expression unguarded, almost glowing. It was not scandalous by nature, nothing overt, but to anyone with the power to interpret context, it was more than enough. It was proof that their secret was no longer safe, proof that someone was watching, proof that the walls they had built to contain their fragile happiness were beginning to crack. Julian arrived at her apartment less than an hour later, summoned by the panicked call she had barely managed to place. He entered with his usual calm stride, but the moment he saw the photograph, his composure faltered. His jaw clenched, his gray eyes darkening as he studied the glossy paper. He turned it over, finding nothing. No note, no signature, only the silent threat that pulsed within the image itself. "This isn't random," Julian said finally, his voice low and steady. "Someone is sending a message." "Rebecca," Natalie whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse. She had no proof, only instinct, but it felt true in her bones. Rebecca Stone had been circling closer, her questions sharper, her eyes always seeming to linger a moment too long. This was exactly her kind of move. Subtle, strategic, a knife delivered in silence before the larger strike. Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the photo back on the table and took Natalie's hands in his touch grounding her spiraling panic. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, we face it together. Do you understand? They can threaten us, they can whisper, they can try to tear us apart, but they don't control what we are to each other." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let his certainty erase the storm building inside her, but her mind raced with images of office whispers growing into headlines, of her colleagues' pitying stares, of her career collapsing before it had ever truly begun. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to become a cautionary tale about the assistant who thought she could catch the attention of her billionaire boss. The following weeks blurred into a constant battle of appearances. At work, the rumors began to thrum louder, no longer just subtle glances or quiet laughter behind partitions. Conversations hushed when Natalie walked into the break room. Her colleagues' smiles turned brittle, their politeness sharpened with unspoken judgment. Jessica, once her confidant, began asking probing questions she couldn't answer, her friendly curiosity shifting into wary suspicion. And through it all, Rebecca Stone loomed larger. Her influence grew quickly. Her name whispered alongside boardroom discussions and restructuring plans. She inserted herself into meetings that had nothing to do with her department, her voice cutting across conversations with the assurance of someone who knew she could not be ignored. When she spoke, people listened, not only because of her authority, but because she carried the implicit weight of those who stood behind her. Natalie avoided her as much as possible, but avoidance proved impossible. The confrontation came one late afternoon when Natalie was leaving the office, her bag slung over her shoulder, her mind aching from the effort of maintaining composure all day. Rebecca appeared at her side in the lobby, walking with long, confident strides. "Miss Rose," she said smoothly, her tone polite but sharp, like glass hidden beneath velvet. "A moment, if you don't mind." Natalie forced a steady breath. "Of course." Rebecca's lips curved in the faintest smile, though her eyes remained cold. "You've been at Crosstech a little over 2 years, yes? Marketing assistant. Modest role, limited upward mobility, and yet, you seem to have attracted unusual attention." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "You must understand how such things look to others." Natalie swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I work hard. I've done nothing inappropriate." "Perhaps not," Rebecca said, her smile widening just slightly. "But perception is everything, Miss Rose, especially in a company of this scale. One rumor, one photograph, one careless whisper, and entire careers can be dismantled." She leaned closer, her voice dropping so only Natalie could hear. "Be careful whose attention you encourage. Not all of us are so forgiving." With that, Rebecca turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, leaving Natalie frozen in place. That night, she broke down in tears in Julian's apartment, the weight of it all finally crashing down. "I can't do this," she confessed, her voice breaking as she clutched at the sleeves of his shirt. "They're going to ruin me, Julian. I'll lose everything I've worked for. I'll be nothing but a joke." Julian pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as though he could shield her from the entire world. "Natalie, listen to me. You are not a joke. You are not replaceable. You are the most real thing in my life, and if anyone dares try to take that from you, they will have to go through me." His voice trembled with a rare intensity, his usual control cracking under the force of his conviction. "I've spent years building this empire, but none of it matters if I can't fight for the one person who sees me as more than a headline." It was then that he made his choice. No more hiding, no more coded emails, no more stolen meetings in glass-walled rooms. The risk had grown too large, the shadows too dangerous. If the world wanted to know, then the world would know. Not through whispers and blackmail, but through his own voice, clear and undeniable. The next morning, whispers rippled across the 15th floor as word spread that Julian Cross had called for an emergency all-staff meeting in the auditorium. Executives scrambled, managers buzzed with confusion. Employees speculated wildly about what could warrant such a sudden gathering. Natalie sat at her desk, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She knew, without him saying a word, what he was about to do. When Julian took the stage, the room fell silent. He looked as composed as always. Immaculate suit, steady posture, commanding presence, but there was something different in his eyes. A quiet fire that made the air feel charged. He began with the expected notes, addressing the company's progress, its challenges, its future vision. But then his voice shifted, deepened, carrying a personal weight that silenced even the quiet rustling of papers. "I've always believed that success means nothing if it costs us our humanity," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "For years I've hidden behind walls both professionally and personally. But recently I've been reminded that honesty is the only foundation worth standing on. There are rumors circulating, rumors about me, about someone I care about deeply, and before those rumors can be twisted into lies, I want you to hear the truth from me." Natalie's breath caught, her body rigid in her chair as hundreds of eyes flickered with anticipation. Julian's gaze steadied, as though he were speaking directly to her despite the vastness of the room. "Yes," he said firmly. "I am in a relationship with someone in this company. Yes, it's unconventional. Yes, it's complicated. But it is real. And I will not apologize for caring about someone who has shown me more honesty, more kindness, and more humanity than I've known in years." The silence that followed was deafening. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by hurried whispers. Rebecca Stone, seated near the front, narrowed her eyes, her expression unreadable. But Julian's gaze never wavered, his voice never faltered. "Anyone who wishes to question my judgment may do so," he continued, his tone unwavering. "But understand this is not a scandal. This is not a weakness. This is a choice, my choice, and I stand by it." In that moment, Natalie felt both terror and awe. He had placed everything on the line, his reputation, his authority, perhaps even his career, just to shield her from the storm that had threatened to consume her. She had feared becoming invisible, reduced to whispers and shadows, but now she stood in the center of a fire that burned too brightly to be ignored. And though fear clawed at her, another truth bloomed beneath it. She was not alone. Whatever came next, whatever battles lay ahead, she and Julian would face them together. The night she would never forget. The days following Julian's announcement felt like living inside a storm, where every gust of wind carried both judgment and revelation. Crosstech had always been a place of numbers, presentations, and structured hierarchies, but suddenly it became something else entirely. A stage where everyone had an opinion, and where whispers no longer hid in corners but blared openly through hallways and conference rooms. Employees traded theories in the cafeteria, executives debated furiously behind closed doors, and the board of directors demanded emergency meetings to discuss the fallout of their CEO's shocking revelation. Natalie, for her part, endured the shift like a soldier caught in a crossfire. Some co-workers eyed her with thinly veiled curiosity, their glances darting to her cubicle as though expecting her to suddenly sprout wings and fly. Others treated her with forced politeness, their conversations stiff and awkward, as if merely speaking to her could align them with controversy. Jessica, once her easy confidant, avoided her now, her friendliness replaced with cautious distance. Natalie felt the sting of their judgment, but she also realized something unexpected. Beneath the discomfort was a strange sense of freedom. The truth was out. There was nothing left to hide, but freedom came with cost. Rebecca Stone moved quickly, striking while the chaos was fresh. She convened meetings with board members, her voice laced with concern for the integrity of leadership and the potential conflicts of interest that could endanger shareholder trust. Her words carried the polished venom of someone who understood both timing and optics. To many, she presented herself as the voice of reason, the strong alternative ready to step in should Julian falter. And faltering seemed inevitable, at least on paper. After all, what board of directors wanted a CEO entangled in a relationship with a subordinate? What investors would not flinch at the mere hint of scandal? Julian, however, did not retreat. In fact, he leaned forward with the kind of conviction that had built his empire in the first place. He addressed the board directly, refusing to let Rebecca or anyone else define his actions. "Yes, I chose transparency," he said in the meeting Natalie would later hear about secondhand. "Yes, it places me under scrutiny. But leadership isn't about living without risk. It's about standing by your values when risk is greatest. If this company cannot withstand the humanity of its leaders, then we are building on sand, not stone." The board was divided. Some admired his boldness. recalling the visionary who had grown Crosstech from a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. Others frowned, wary of headlines and market reactions. Rebecca pressed harder, urging them to consider the stability of the company. But her insistence also revealed her ambition. A few directors whispered that her hunger for power was too naked, too calculated. The storm raged, but no immediate decision was reached. Meanwhile, Natalie wrestled with her own torment. At night, when she sat in Julian's apartment overlooking the city, she could see the toll it was taking on him. The lines deepening at the corners of his eyes, the weight settling heavier on his shoulders. Yet he never once spoke of regret. Instead, he held her close and said, "This is worth it. You are worth it." One evening, as rain pattered softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Natalie finally voiced the question that had haunted her since the photograph first appeared. What if they force you out? What if Rebecca wins? What if everything you've built is taken from you because of me? Julian turned from the window, his expression shadowed but resolute. "Then I'll build again. I've done it before and I'll do it again. But I will not build a life on lies, Natalie. Not for a board. Not for an empire. And not even for my own pride. If leadership costs me the chance to be real, then it isn't worth keeping." His words struck her deeply, peeling away the last layers of fear she had clung to. For so long, Natalie had defined herself by invisibility, by her role as the quiet assistant no one noticed. But Julian's choice, his willingness to place everything at risk for her, demanded that she choose as well. Would she remain a shadow, shrinking beneath judgment, or would she step into the light and claim her own voice? The answer came sooner than she expected. A week later, the company auditorium once again filled, this time for a board-announced forum intended to address the recent events and their implications. The air buzzed with tension as employees gathered. Eager for clarity, hungry for resolution, Rebecca sat near the stage, poised and polished, her eyes sharp with anticipation. Julian stood to one side, calm but steady, the weight of the moment pressing visibly against him. And Natalie, though every nerve screamed to stay hidden, chose to sit in the front row. The forum began with speeches from board members, measured words about professionalism, ethics, and perception. Rebecca rose next, her voice smooth, her arguments meticulously crafted. She spoke of protecting the company's reputation, of ensuring leadership remains above reproach, of the need for clear, decisive action. Applause followed her words, though not as thunderous as she might have hoped. Then Julian stood. His voice carried easily, firm and unwavering. "I have already told you the truth," he said. "I will not repeat it in rehearsed phrases. What matters now is whether we believe this company is stronger when its leaders are allowed to be human, or whether we demand that they become statues. Statues may look impressive, but they do not build. They do not innovate. They do not care. And I will never be a statue." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, then lowered it briefly to Natalie in the front row. "I know my choice has consequences. I accept them. But I will not allow fear to dictate my life. And I will not allow fear to dictate the future of this company." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that carried not just shock but possibility. And it was then that Natalie realized her own silence was no longer acceptable. Slowly, her hands trembling, she rose from her seat. All eyes turned to her, the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down. Her throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. "I never asked for this attention," she began, her voice soft but growing steadier. "I never asked to be noticed, to be judged, or to be dragged into whispers. But I will not let anyone reduce what we share to rumors and lies. I care about Julian. Not the CEO, not the headlines, but the man who listens when I speak, who remembers the small things about me no one else sees. That's the truth. And I would rather stand in this storm with him than hide safely in the shadows without him." A murmur swept the auditorium. Some faces softened, others hardened. But the truth hung in the air like a spark that could not be extinguished. Rebecca's expression faltered for the briefest second, her confidence slipping as the narrative shifted beyond her control. The forum ended without a resolution, but something had changed. The board, divided though it remained, could not deny the power of what had been spoken. Investors still called, headlines still buzzed, but within Crosstech the tide began to turn. Employees who once whispered with judgment now spoke with quiet admiration. Some saw in Julian's defiance a reflection of the visionary they had once followed without question. Others saw in Natalie the courage they themselves wished they possessed. Weeks later, the board delivered its decision. Julian would remain CEO. His personal life, while unconventional, did not outweigh the years of leadership and vision he had given the company. Rebecca Stone, sensing her bid for power slipping beyond recovery, announced her resignation and departed with cold grace. For Natalie and Julian, life did not suddenly become easy. The scrutiny lingered, the headlines faded slowly, and the eyes of the world never fully turned away. But the fear that once held them captive no longer ruled them. They walked openly now, no longer hiding in shadow, their bond tempered by fire rather than shattered by it. And one evening, as they walked once more along the waterfront where so much had begun, Julian turned to her with a quiet smile. "Do you remember that night?" he asked. "How could I forget?" Natalie replied, her voice soft, her heart full. "It was supposed to be a boring date," Julian laughed, his arm slipping around her shoulders. "And instead it was the night I found what I didn't even know I was looking for." Natalie leaned into him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, and realized that the life she had once thought ordinary, predictable, and invisible had transformed into something extraordinary. A night that had begun in disappointment had led her to courage, to love, to a future she had never dared imagine. It was truly a night she would never forget.